system. So that's one interpretation. Personally speaking, I would defend that interpretation. Many people would say that that's not compatible for whatever reasons, but I think to be charitable to Nietzsche, I think that's a good way of interpreting it. Obviously, a negative way of interpreting this is to talk about sort of calculated genocide, literally to talk about the extermination of the weak. And this is obviously what Adolf Hitler did, right? So if there is any relevance that Nietzsche influenced Hitler's crusade of destruction, then crusade is a bad word to choose, but Hitler's, funny enough, Hitler believed that in providence, right? I've read Mein Kampf, and Hitler talks ad nauseum about providence. The whole point of this interpretation, this negative interpretation of Nietzsche, I think it's obviously justifiable because Nietzsche says right here, and I've bold and highlighted this point in the discussion because I know it's a good talking point, and I've incorporated the notes so you can do your own interpretation, your own discussions. The species requires that the ill-constituted, weak, degenerate perish. Nietzsche has just, in what, not just, but almost 100 notes ago, in 170, waged a pretty caustic critique of Christian moral tradition for being too literal. When we talk about resurrection, you think about biological resurrection. When we talk about immortality, you're thinking about biological immortality. I think, to be fair to Nietzsche, you shouldn't be so literal in the interpretation of Nietzsche. In this text, Nietzsche obviously meant that it's justifiable to kill people. I don't know that that is true. There's merit to that. But this is a good talking point. This is a good back and forth point for debate, especially if you're an educator, you're going to use this in one of your classes. Defend the stance that Nietzsche's critique or point in note 246 is a defense of biological extermination. Defend the stance in note 246 that Nietzsche's point is assessment is not a defense of biological extermination, but a defense of the transformation, right? The psychological transformation that's needed within the Christian population so that they sacrifice, they kill off, they perish the old mentality, the slave mentality, and adopt this new mentality which has yet to be named. So, interpret that part however you want. I think it's a great note, right? And I think it's a great point for discussion. Okay. Next point on power. I'm going to need a new marker soon. Where's my marker? All right. So on power, bottom of page 42. First point. Nietzsche says in note 244, quote, "We seem," so now obviously we've changed the topic. We're no longer talking about the influence of Christianity. We're talking about this idea of power. Right? Obviously the title of the book is Will to Power, and we're going to talk more about power. So now, point one, quote, "We seem that every high degree of power involves freedom from good and evil and from true and false." Right? We see that every high degree of power, right, to rise to a high degree of power, right, to arrive at a high degree, right, of power, we see that to arrive at a high degree of power involves freedom from, right, liberation from. What are we trying to free ourselves from? We see that every high degree of power involves freedom from good and evil and from true and false, and cannot take into account the demands of goodness. Right? Freedom from what? Freedom from, he doesn't say this explicitly now, for those of you who know Nietzsche, for those of you who have read Will to Power, you know where this is going, so I don't mind sort of throwing it out there yet. From this dichotomous polemic, this binary opposition, right? This random binary opposition, right? This idea of good and bad, up and down, left and right, man and woman, black and white, good and evil, blah, blah, blah. This is known as binary opposition, right? Freedom from binary, B-I-N-A. He doesn't say this obviously here, but binary oppositions. And this is a very good point, right? This is a very, very good point, right? So, a high degree of power requires, right? It involves freedom from binary oppositions. This idea of binary oppositions, to be really ghetto at this point and really be sort of just like frank about the matter, it's like, is it really good? Is it really evil? Right? To the victor goes the spoils. Right? That's an adage, right? To the victor goes the spoils. Insofar as I am the victor, I determine what good is. I won the battle. So since I won the battle, I write history. If I write history, then the person who was my opposition becomes the force of all that which is bad, all that which is evil. Not only is it the case that to the victor goes the spoils, to the victor goes the ability to construct the narrative of good and evil, right? If the British were to have won in the independence that America was attaining to get for itself, to liberate itself from England, if it were the case that they would have won, we would have been the bad guys. It's not that they're the bad guys and we're the bad guys, right? It's not the fact that they're good and we're evil, or we're good and they're evil. Nietzsche recognized that there's so much gray. There's so much gray, right? This idea of binary opposition, this sort of mutual exclusion, either A or B, but not A and B, fails to see the fact that so many points within the world, so many points where we can have a deeper understanding of our relationship to reality, to the truth, our attempt to grasp and understand that which is true in the world, which is what philosophy, physics, science, sociology, this is what all these disciplines do, is try to make some sense of truth. That it's rare, if ever the case, that truth will reside in this sort of dogmatic binary opposition. And those people who have a high degree of power recognize this. What does this mean? To go back to moralism, I had a pretty, just quick tangent, I had a pretty good discussion with a friend of mine, Alex, on Facebook, and Alex says, in a note, in a private message he sent to me, he said, Dr. Campbell, you sort of went a little off topic with your discussion of immorality in Nietzsche. I started good, but I went off topic. And my response to him was, I'm a bit of a showman. This is showmanship, right? This whole YouTube channel is a bit of showmanship. Philosophy is cool. Being a nerd is cool. Getting this deep in one text and now being 25 hours in and I'm only on page 143, it's cool. It's nerdy, but it's cool. Why did I bring that up? The idea of immorality, right? The idea of immorality in Nietzsche really is based in the notion that I am not going to allow these sort of polemic, arbitrary, binary, socially constructed oppositions to define how I govern myself in the world. Just because you say it's immoral, just because you say it's bad, just because you have constructed this edifice with which it governs the norms, or religiously speaking, norms socially speaking, or religiously speaking, the commandments which govern members of the population. Insofar as I rebuke, to use a loaded term, insofar as I rebuke those norms, insofar as I rebuke those commandments, I step outside of that value system. And that value system which contains and governs you doesn't contain and govern me. We live in the exact same geographical area, but you are being controlled by a value system that is set up to make you docile. I live in exactly the same geographic region as you, but I'm able to do so much more than you are because I have opted out of that system of control. And if I'm really sort of, well, I don't want to go too far, but I can also create a value system to control you, right? So you sort of recognize what's going on. So, it's good stuff. It's profoundly good. If you want to get to power, which is the whole point of this entire 25 hours of lecture, is about power, right? Unfortunately, he didn't call it a will to, equality, or a will to justice, or a will to salvation. It's a will to power. this whole thing is about